All right, guys, we're going to get started. This is the Climate Change Solutions panel with blockchain. Okay, so I think most people, when they think of climate change or energy when related to blockchain, they think proof of work, crypto, and that's not really what we're going to focus on. We want to change the narrative around cryptocurrencies and blockchain's contribution to helping draw down climate change rather than adding to it. So has everyone seen the IPCC report, at least heard the summary recently? The most recent one is the most immediate need yet. It was just released, and 6,000 scientific references, over 90 authors, all say that in the next 12 years, by 2030, we will need to reduce our carbon emissions by 45%, which is pretty dramatic to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's a pretty, there's actually a really big difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, and a little further out. So we're going to mostly talk in more quantifiable metrics, which is parts per million of carbon, and that's something that you can actually measure and incentivize towards reducing and actually drawing down. So just to introduce myself, I'm Kylen McClintock, and I help run blockchain for sustainable development. I also run proof of impact, which is environmental sensors as oracles of impact at a project called Flux. And I'm gonna just pass this around to you guys, say why you are here today and why blockchain is relevant to climate change. Tell us what you do.
Thanks, Kylen. My name's Paul Gamble. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of a company called Nori. And Nori's mission is just reversing climate change itself. So what we're building and planning to launch later this year is a carbon removal marketplace, where we make it as simple as possible to get paid for and to pay for removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So we're initially working with farmers who are sequestering carbon in their soils. This is called Regenerative Agriculture, and I think we'll talk more about this. But there are many more ways to remove CO2, and just kind of what Kylen was just saying about the 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees targets. So I got very interested in climate change about 4 years ago because, to me, the concerning thing is, as the climate warms, we'll start to see more mass migrations, more refugee crises, and wars, and I would really prefer to avoid those. So it turns out that there are a lot of different ways to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they exist today. There are technologies that are available for this. There are ecological methods for it, but they're missing an incentive. They're missing the need and driver to scale them up, and that's what Nori is building to try to create. So we'll pass it on.
Thank you. I'm Alan Lewis from Natural Grocers. I've been there for 15 years. I handle the food and ag policy, supply chain integrity, and organic compliance. Best job in the world because I get to run around the United States and some foreign countries talking with farmers and community leaders about all of these issues. Soil's pretty interesting because if you do a soil test, you will be on your belly with measurement tools and magnifying glasses and looking for bugs and worms and whatnot. But it's really anecdotal for the most part. It's descriptive. What are you seeing? And there's 20 indicators of soil health, and soil health is directly related to the amount of carbon that stays underground and is captured from the atmosphere, related to everything that we're talking about today. When it comes to blockchain, the critical issue that I'm working on is how do you embed microsensors in the soil or somewhere on the farm, capture that data, make it immutable, geotag it, protect it, authenticate it, and collect such massive amounts that you can actually apply AI, machine learning, and simple mathematics to that to see whether there are changes taking place and whether those are the changes that you want, which leads into exactly what Nori's doing. I'll talk a little bit later about just how hard that is. But this is the right place to be. Forget everything else out there. This is so critical. If we don't fix this, we'll be blockchaining our coffins.
I second that. My name is Jennifer Jericho, and I am the CEO of a company called Sustainable Pacific Consulting. It's based in Hawaii. I moved recently from Hawaii, and I'm also an adjunct professor at CU Boulder in the Sustainability Planning Department. Well, it's actually the Masters of the Environment program in the Sustainability Planning track. So I teach a lot of different classes on sustainability. Sustainability strategy, sustainability, right now I'm teaching sustainability indicators and metrics, and I'm fascinated by blockchain more recently because I think that the potential is huge, and it is going to change the way that we measure things going forward, the way that we monitor our sustainability performance, and especially related to climate change and our carbon impacts. It just offers so much potential to be able to curb that and to look at ways to make it better. And as Paul was saying, and sequestering carbon, trying to avoid it, not avoid it, you have to remove it, right? And within the supply chain alone, what Alan does with looking at the supply chain of food, it's limitless, the opportunities in blockchain of how it can actually benefit us and benefit the world. So I'm excited to be here. I did work on a regenerative ag project where we looked at soil content and measuring the soil over time and seeing how much carbon could be sequestered and changing the health of the soil. And even today, there's a new company that just came out. I just read about it yesterday, and they're actually able to track from your microbiome all the way back to the farm and the soil where the food that you ate that contributed to that came from. And I'm not sure if it's connected with blockchain. I know they're using technology to do this, but there's so many cool applications for making it a healthier planet, healthier people. So thank you for having me here today.
Maybe we should talk about what exactly regenerative agriculture is and how that makes an impact on carbon in the atmosphere.
Yeah, so we only have half an hour, and there's a lot to cover in climate change, and there's a lot of different ways to go about this. Most carbon credits, which we usually think of when we're thinking of blockchain as an obvious way to create immutability, stop the double spend problem, they're mostly focusing on emissions reduction, which is really not going to be quite enough to pull us out of what is the sixth extinction, this new geological phase, the Anthropocene. We need carbon drawdown as well, and that will be what creates the most impact. And we're going to focus, because we have three amazing luminaries in the regenerative agriculture space, on this solution that actually has a very large untapped potential to transition the world, at least get a good chunk of that 45% emissions reduction by drawing down. So we're going to focus quite a bit on that.
Did you want me to answer your question, Paul?
Yes.
Okay. So how many have I said, I have healthy soil in my garden, would know what that means? We're talking about soil here, and in my little world, it's all we talk about in incredible depth, ad nauseum, conference after conference, after site visit. So I think it's the right place to start, and I think I can do this in 45 seconds. Time me. So when you think of dirt has nothing in it but some minerals, some sand, some clay. And when you put a seed in dirt, it puts a little root down, it puts a tiny leaf up, and it puts a little root down. But in that dirt are various unconnected microbes and fungi that sense that the root is growing and then are attracted to the root, bring moisture to the root, and convert the minerals and the other things in the dirt so that the root can absorb it. Simultaneously, that leaf that goes up is using photosynthesis, water, atmosphere, and sunlight to create sugars that are going down into the root and feeding what? They're feeding the fungi and the microbes. So it's this symbiotic system, the soil biome. Both need each other. In fact, I would say that the amount of life underneath ground for every little plant that's growing in your garden or in a field is about 10 times in quantity as what you see above ground. If you do something different called industrial agriculture, and you take dirt and you pump nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium into that dirt, you can get that root to get the minimum amount of nutrients so it'll grow and it'll create an ear of corn or a soybean or a cotton boll. One of them is taking carbon out of the soil. The other one is accumulating carbon in the soil, and it's a carbohydrate from photosynthesis in the roots that stay in the soil and remove it from the atmosphere, and it can sequester it there indefinitely. I'll stop.
Thank you. And so the project that I worked on related to regenerative ag, and the way that I understood it, is the quality of the soil, but it's this whole process. If anyone's read the Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan in the room, did anyone read that? So if you remember, there's a farm, they talked about polyface farms. So we worked with polyface farms to implement those same strategies. And it's the way you work with the animals even, and their impacts on the soil, and how that you rotate the animals in a faster way, and then you'll like have the cows come through, and then the chickens come through, and they actually right afterward, and you rotate them every 2 days, and so then the chickens are eating the maggots off of the cow manure and so forth. And so it creates this, it regenerates the soil, and it restores water into the soil. And so in the project I worked on was in Maui, Hawaii, and there's been a ton of chemical damage from pesticides and other things from pineapple growing, sugar growing. And so we've been working to restore the health of the soil for a lot of the reasons that Alan just mentioned, to have healthier soil, to have healthier food, healthier people, healthier animals overall. And so in summary, it's a way to manage agriculture that produces healthier benefits for all. And blockchain has a way to be able to measure that. So it's kind of the same quote, you can't manage what you can't measure. So it provides a great way to be able to measure all of these different components to improve it over time.
Yeah, so when it comes to dealing with storing carbon in soils, that measurement is a challenge. And really what ends up happening is the grower or the farmer changes their farming practices. So instead of like what Alan was talking about, the sort of industrial approach where you're just pumping fertilizer into the ground, which is over time causing soil erosion. We're degrading the qualities of our soils. Instead, farmers can do things like reducing the amount that they till or plow, because when you till the land, you're turning over the soil and exposing all that organic matter to the air, and it just decomposes and dies. You can also plant cover crops and do crop rotations. But measuring this is a difficult challenge, and this is where it comes back to the blockchain aspect of it, because if we're talking about creating an incentive for farmers to be sequestering carbon in their soils, the entities, the companies or individuals who want to pay these farmers want to be absolutely sure that what they're paying for is what happened. And there are lots of problems in existing carbon markets today where most carbon credits that are traded are double counted, meaning the people who do the project that does the carbon avoidance, they count it as avoiding emissions, and then the people who buy the carbon credits from them count it as avoiding emissions, so it's getting counted twice, and that's a real problem. So what Nori is doing is we're creating the infrastructure so that buyers who want to pay farmers for storing carbon in their soil can be sure that what they're paying for is what happened. And then when they purchase, we call this a carbon removal certificate, which is just a non-fungible token. When they purchase this CRC from the farmer, then it's immediately retired, to use the language from carbon markets, meaning it's not transferable. You can't just go resell it. And at NORI, we're working with a group at Colorado State University called Comet Farm. And Comet Farm is a modeling system that takes in cropping practice data from the farmers. So they provide information like what crops they were growing, when they planted, when they harvested, what sort of fertilizer they used, where exactly their fields are located. And all of that information comes into Comet Farm. And then Comet Farm is composed of, I think, 34 different models. So they have weather data and imagery data and soil samples that have been taken from different regions around the US. And then they can return an estimate on your actual soil carbon levels. But we have to get that data verified, because how do we know that the farmer is providing true and accurate data? So we're working with independent third-party verifiers that verify the data that the farmers provide is accurate and true. And that's where the interesting business case is, because when we're talking about companies that want to pay for sequestering carbon in soil, the big buyers right now are food producers, food production companies. So think of like General Mills and Cargill and Danone, McDonald's, Ben & Jerry's. All of these companies have been putting money in to trying to figure out how to pay their farmers to sequester carbon in their soil, because for them, it's just an investment in their supply chain. They're ensuring that they're going to have high quality food that they can sell later on down the road. So what we're doing at NORI is like dramatically simplifying that process so that that data comes in, it gets verified, and then they're paying for that.
So there's multiple practical business cases for making the transition to regenerative agriculture and actually internalizing the carbon externality that is industrial farming. And one of them obviously is showing that through the supply chain that you are being organic and locally sourced, carbon negative actually, but really what will make this possible on a global scale is when we have the capacity to implement that into a true carbon market. And I think I want to talk about how we get there. What is the process to getting there, because that's really how we're going to make this transition at the level we're going to have to do it. And I think this is a perfect confluence of time where you have IoT sensors dramatically coming down in price that can start to measure the impact of either carbon and air pollution and other chemicals in the soil that can actually then be tracked via the blockchain versus with proof of impact, and then go up through the supply chain. That's marking like a provenance of the goods, not just when and where it came from, but how it was grown and how many miles it took to get there, and we can aggregate the carbon emissions from that. And once we can start to prove this out, then we can start to go to larger and larger institutions like Denver County, then Colorado, then potentially the United States and a global level to help implement this as a way for governments to finally have a way to internalize the cost, the externalities. Because it wouldn't be fair to have a factory spewing out air pollution. Like we modify that because we put a price on that. We limit it because it directly affects someone else. But carbon is a little more abstract because it goes into the atmosphere, and it's a global externality, global tragedy of the commons. So let's talk about actual practical ways how we're going to get this implemented on a global scale.
So here's where we are. It's kind of comically simple, but it actually works. We're measuring temperature and moisture at depth. So soil in Colorado tends to have less than 0.5% organic matter. We also tend to plant one crop and then let that go fallow and uncovered. So in those instances, you have really hot topsoil that crusts over 110, 120 degrees sometimes in a hot summer day. And you also are losing so much moisture because it's uncovered. So if you're talking about a 48-inch spread and you are embedding an IoT sensor at 2 inches, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, and you can ping that with low energy over time and aggregate that, you're going to be able to see that the way that that crop or that farm is growing their food has cover crops, isn't deep tilled, is generating more organic matter, and those are the proxies. The temperature and the moisture are proxies for healthy soil. You blockchain all of that in the hardware as it comes out, but then the produce, whatever that farm is growing, whether it's cattle or crops or vegetables, when you lot those harvests, you blockchain those harvests with that special tag. This is authenticated carbon positive, or carbon friendly at least, and that is another flag related to organic or regenerative or other processes that we're familiar with, but bring up that recognition for the environmental services provided by that farmer.
So one of the things that I thought of, and actually we had this conversation just before this panel that I think is interesting to build on what Alan was saying, was we were talking about when you go to the grocery store and you have these different options, right? So you say you have the organic local kale, or you have kale that's from Mexico or somewhere else, right? And you choose, and usually the kale, the non-organic, or even if it's, say they're both, neither of them are organic, but one is from a lot further away, but it's cheaper. Well, the externalities that he's talking about, you're not seeing the carbon footprint of that kale, right? So this is what blockchain has the ability to do eventually, is to actually see. So if you're going and you're buying, you're like, oh, well, the carbon footprint of this was 10 times higher than this one. There's the consumer demand. You can choose to kind of pay for the difference in the carbon, right. But it could also change the way that farmers are doing things, right? So that creates like a healthy competition to try to lower the carbon footprint of all of the different types of fruits and vegetables that you're purchasing. If you could actually see, and through blockchain, it could be in an instant, right? Where you could actually measure it, the whole supply chain of where something's coming from, and the whole footprint. And think of, it's not just growing it, it's, all of the shipping, the transportation, everything out, and the water content and all of that. And a lot of times when it's not organic, there's a higher water content because they're using all different kinds of methods to fertilize, pesticides, and do everything else. So I think that is a huge potential of blockchain, to be able to see, actually see the externalities right away, and make better decisions for our health.
The
and
true cost of the goods.
The true cost of the good of that cheaper kale is actually much higher than the local kale that you're buying. Correct.
There are also other uses for this too, where this idea of storing carbon in soil is generally called an ecosystem service, and there are lots of other types of ecosystem services that can be monetized and incentives created for things like better water filtration. I know a group that's trying to figure out a way to incentivize people, or especially wastewater treatment facilities in the Puget Sound. Nori's headquartered in Seattle, so in the Puget Sound. I also know groups that are interested in trying to figure out ways to deal with the massive forest fire issues out here in the West, in which many cases are that there's a significant amount of slash left on the ground of small diameter timber that isn't really worth it for the logging companies to pick up right now. So how do we create an incentive for someone to go do that so we reduce the risk of these massive forest fires? One thing that we did at Nori was we created and open sourced what we're calling our atomic swap marketplace. And you can find this on Nori's GitHub. It's nori-dot.eco. And So we've created the ability for you to create a non-fungible token that represents some sort of ecosystem service action that happened. That could be anything. That could be you removed half a ton of this slash, or you stored a ton of carbon. And then you can exchange that for a fungible token, so for like an ERC20 token. And you can do that atomically so that the market operator never takes ownership. And that's what we're offering to the market, where Nori never takes ownership of these carbon removal certificates, and we never take ownership of the Nori tokens that people are using to pay. But we did this because we wanted to create this as a template. We want more people to create other businesses and projects where people can create financial incentives for doing some sort of environmental cleanup, some ecosystem service. So that's something that's out there, and it would be great if other people pick that up.
So this is actually really, really interesting. I think this is one of the ways we put externalities into the cost of goods, and I think it's kind of understated how much potential this has. We talk carbon when it comes to climate and environment because that's something quantifiable, something we've been tracking for so long, when these other things are more abstract, like air pollution or just trash in the ocean or water pollution in general. They're harder to measure quantifiably with a verifiable oracle of impact. But once we have these tools and we can start to leverage them on a more local level, then we'll start to see this market evolve for companies coming in to help verify changes in ecosystem states, which is really, really cool. So that's something that's out there for you guys, for blockchain. Carbon is just one of the many externalities affecting our planet. There's methane, which is obviously very impactful. There's a new company out there that actually puts up satellites to measure methane, can even measure the leaks from natural gas pipes. So that opens up the potential to start putting a market around methane. And then we can start correlating, all right, so this holistic grazing opportunity to use large ruminants, like bringing back bison to grasslands, actually has great potential to reforest and re-grassify desertified regions, but we still haven't proven out the science. It puts carbon in the soil, but there's also methane in the air. So then we can start to see these correlations between, all right, how much is the methane completely counteracting all the benefits of the carbon? We're not completely sure because we don't have enough data. So I would certainly urge you to find ways to collect authenticated data and build businesses around that, because governments and nonprofits, they need ways to internalize these externalities and give incentives to make this transition to a regenerative future, less of an extractive future. So there's a lot of other drawdown methods out there that haven't been talked about quite as much as carbon. So I would love for you guys, if you have kind of a favorite one that's more obscure that we can track and is relevant to the blockchain, please let everyone know.
So at Nori, we think about carbon removal in sort of three different buckets. There are ecological methods, industrial methods, and then hybrid approaches that kind of combine the two. On the ecological side, soil is the biggest one, but then there's also just simply planting trees, afforestation. Kelp is fantastic. That's why we named our company Nori. On the industrial side, I'm most excited about a couple different opportunities. One is called direct air capture. So there are a number of different companies out there, Climeworks, Carbon Engineering, Global Thermostat, or to name a few, that they pull in air from the atmosphere and they separate the CO2 from the rest of the gases, and then you can sell that CO2 to manufacturers that might make plastics or tennis shoes or construction materials out of it. Construction materials is the other one. So I really think that when it comes to scaling up, how do we remove the amount of carbon dioxide that we need to remove, it's going to be the industrial approach. And I actually believe that it's going to be the oil and gas industry that saves the day. Because who out there has the engineering talent, the financial resources, the access to energy, and the familiarity with building large-scale industrial projects. They're the ones who are going to be able to scale up this direct air capture into another form of ecosystem services that I heard someone the other day coin a term called atmospheric services. So direct air capture is the one that I'm really excited about.
Just to touch on that real quick, that's not going to happen unless we put a price on these externalities, right? It's not a viable business model just to capture carbon and put it in the ground because it's good for the planet. We need to start valuing these things.
So, Kylen, what I heard your question was the other options for drawdown or other ways
highly impactful
related to climate change. So I teach this, I do consulting on it, collecting data on all of these different areas. So we collect data on energy, water use, waste produced, invasive species. I mean, the list goes on, and it is so difficult to collect data. And then I teach it, and then I have my students try to go out there and get the data, and then they get stressed out because they can't get the data. So I think one of the best things that blockchain does is it actually makes that data available. But even things like, does anyone, well, I'm sure you know, but if you think of energy, just one thing, which contributes to carbon too, but the energy sources in Colorado, it's mostly coal, right? Which has a huge air pollution effect, right? And then there's also natural gas, which is connected to fracking, and you hear people screaming in town hall meetings over this, right? And then renewable energy is actually really small. But if you were able to actually even track just not the carbon, but just the energy from everything and all of the externalities related to that, I mean, it's so huge. I mean, I don't even know where to start with it, but they're everything, water, waste. I mean, the ocean's polluted, you brought up that. If you could actually see where each piece of waste came from, and plastic companies are a huge part of that.
Look at the oceans too. They're a major carbon sink, and not as many people are focusing on the oceans. So look at their potential. Give Alan a chance, but I also want
islands
to.
They are, right?
We're running out of time, so I want to make sure we get a chance to tell what should we be doing in 2019 in the blockchain space. How can we make the most impact?
Okay, well, I just have to tell you, when I checked in today, someone looked at my hair and actually asked me if I had a smartphone. It's a good way to start the day. But we are creatures of our time, right? And I see a couple of old folks in the room. 35 years ago, spreadsheets were brand new, and I ran conferences like this convincing businesses to adopt digital accounting, right? The reason I'm bringing this up is right now we're in this globalized food system, but globalized system in general. And there's two broad divergent places. One is the multinational, global, consolidated, centralized, standardized supply chain, which are run by Oracle and SAP, big enterprise resource planning systems, and I don't even know what energy system uses. There's a parallel economy that I think all of us in the room are a lot more comfortable with. The parallel economy starts in rural economic communities with farms, with farm families, with young couples wanting to move to a more wholesome environment and have an agrarian lifestyle. The role of blockchain there in terms of protecting their data, protecting the identity of their food, increasing the value in the broadest term of what they're growing is incredibly important because they're fighting that big globalization, and we really need to support that. It's a lot of what Nori's doing, a lot of what we're all working on. But when you think about 35 years ago, the opportunities I had were comical, but the opportunity here is very deeply democratic and equitable opportunity to use blockchain to support our communities, urban and rural, in creating that connection, but making sure that 10 or 20 years from now, we really have good food choices and good environmental choices.
Yeah, it's about a closer connection with the producer and the consumer as well. There's countless opportunities to create better co-op structures as well here that just connects everyone together more. And that future of a multinational corporation, Monsanto, GlaxoSmithKline, that's not an inevitable future.
I would just add one thing too. I mean, if you're going to be in blockchain, I mean, you could be in it for so many different. There's so many different areas, but this is one area where you have the potential to make a huge difference in the world in a positive way, and to create healthier food, healthier products, a healthier quality of life for everyone around the world. So that's what I would encourage you to look into all of these solutions related to blockchain that help do that.
Great. Thank you guys so much. We are going to be up at the impact track table, so please, if you have any questions, come up there, and we'd love to help out with some projects.